For a lot of developers, deploying your own app can be seen as a rite of passage. You've made this great application, and now you're ready to show the world. It makes sense to want to learn how to do this on your own. I've spoken to a number of developers, and the story is usually the same. It's exactly what I did too. So here's my story on what eventually led me to using Docker. Today is the day I'm going to learn how to set up a server. I started Googling around to see what other people thought was the best Linux distribution to use for hosting web applications. And after a day or two, I eventually came to the conclusion that I wanted to use Debian. It was seen as a rock-solid Linux distro to use on a server and had a lot of community support backing it. I was sold. Naturally, I wasn't ready to pick a hosting provider, but I did want to install Debian. I had already known about virtual machines, so I downloaded VirtualBox since it was free and installed Debian onto it. In case you don't know, a virtual machine allows you to run another operating system alongside your current operating system. You can think of it as running an operating system as an application. It's something you can start up and shut down. Once Debian was installed, then I continued Googling for days while consuming a bunch of blog posts. I eventually found a really long post to read. It took me all day and I had to run like 30 different commands, but it worked. I had my application running in a virtual machine on my workstation. The only problem is by the time I finished reading it, I had already forgotten what I did at the start. It was just too much to take in, and now I wanted to get my application running on a public server. After another few days of research, I found a virtual private server, also known as a VPS, to host my app on. Back then, DigitalOcean wasn't around. I was just using the VPS plan from an old shared hosting provider I used in the past. I signed up and started to follow along just like I did on my virtual machine. The only problem was I couldn't get it to work. I gave up after a few days of tinkering and research and eventually came to the conclusion that the hosting provider I was using had a much older version of Debian running than the one used in the blog post. One of the packages I had to install didn't work because it was much older and I had no idea how to fix it on my own. I pretty much rage quit at this point for an amount of time that I can't remember. It was on the order of days though. After I cleared my head, I went and found a new hosting provider that had a VPS equipped with a version of Debian that I wanted, and I started to follow the guide again. It took about a full day, but I had my app running and it actually worked. I felt really happy. I finally deployed my first application on my own. The only problem is it took like 2 weeks, required nearly a day to configure everything, and was really prone to human error. Phrases such as security, database backup, and resiliency weren't even in my vocabulary. I decided to get clever and wiped the virtual machine on my workstation. Then I followed along with the blog post I had been using and wrote my own notes this time. I managed to condense his novel into a bunch of short commands with a few comments to remind myself what the heck was going on. Now it only took me 3 hours of entering in a few dozen commands, but I consider this a success. It was a workflow that I could follow, and at the end of the day, that's a beautiful thing. When I got hired to do a project for a client, I had to set up a server for his site too. I followed my precious workflow and it worked. I even got paid an affiliate commission for recommending him to the hosting provider I used. I was on the top of the world. Oh yeah. Things were awesome until one day my website was throwing a database error. Long story short, I should have picked a better root password. That was the day I learned about security and database backups. And it took me a week of reading a bunch of blog posts and watching videos until I sort of figured things out. I added those features to my bag of tricks and moved on with life. Luckily, I secured my client server before anything bad happened to him. This process basically went on for a while. I had a number of clients, and I was still setting things up manually, but it worked. One day, I read some post about configuration management. I think this was around 2010. The post was about Chef and how to set it up. It seemed amazing on paper. After about 6 months of researching and using it, I decided I was wasting my time. It was just super complicated for me at the time, and a lot of other people seemed to have a similar experience. But to be fair, at the same time, others were using it with great success. I took some time off and just crawled back to using my manual approach until I found out about Ansible. Ansible is another configuration management tool, but its philosophy and abstractions were much better than Chef in my opinion. I began using Ansible with pretty great success. After investing months of time with it, I had built up things that allowed me to set up a new server pretty quickly. I could basically run a few commands and the server would provision itself. I was using it on my workstation to provision raw Linux containers so I could develop my apps in isolation, and I also used it to deploy a few sites to production. I thought I found the holy grail until I started to have a number of deploys fail on me for reasons that I couldn't control, such as Ruby gems failing to connect or an apt mirror being down. I was pretty happy with Ansible, but I wasn't 100% sold on it. I started looking into other things like SaltStack, but quickly came to the conclusion that the same problems would persist. Time went on, and I remember listening to this great talk about immutable infrastructure, and that eventually led me down the path of learning about Docker. It really blew my mind to think that I could be shipping around an image that already has everything installed onto it. There's nothing to provision because it already exists. Holy cow. So naturally I picked up Docker and have been using it ever since. I'm really betting on Docker to be around in the long-term future. I imagine there will be all sorts of interesting platforms built on top of it in the upcoming years. It's already starting now.